Good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Barsanti. I'm the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Juneteenth Freedom Program. The Library Company has had a Juneteenth Freedom event for many years. Tonight is special. I think one of the things that makes tonight special is, I don't know if you've caught up on your news, but today, just an hour or two ago, President Biden signed a law that makes Juneteenth an official federal holiday. Starting, I think it's going to be recognized tomorrow and then moving forward. It's the first new federal holiday since Martin Luther King Day, 1983. So it is not Juneteenth today, but almost as good as celebrating on the same day that Juneteenth becomes a federal holiday. So very glad for that. I'm very pleased to be able to announce it if you hadn't heard it yet. Tonight, we will be joined by Professor Stephanie Jones Rogers, who will be talking about her book, They Were Her Property. This is a book that has been really vaunted into the front of important books of the last few years describing the conditions in full detail of American slavery. Professor Jones Rogers will be introduced by Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens, the director of our program in African American history, shortly. I wanted to just give you a couple of housekeeping details. One is that this is being presented in a webinar format. And as a result, if we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you have questions you want to ask, I would ask you to use the Q&A button that you'll find near the bottom of your screen. And that would be the right place to do it and not in the chat next door. But if you have questions, post them under the Q&A and we'll be able to answer them better. I'm remiss in saying that in addition to Professor Jones Rogers, we also have the poet David Mills, who's going to be joining us, who has a work he'll be reading as a kind of counterpoint and a sort of adjacent piece to Professor Jones Rogers talking about her work. So we have two wonderful speakers tonight that I hope you will enjoy. I also wanted to specifically welcome the attorneys and the interns from the Archer and Grenier Law Office. This is a firm we're beginning a relationship with, one of Philadelphia's most prominent law firms. And this is they are reaching out and wanted to do something for Juneteenth. And we're very happy to welcome them as a group participating in this event tonight. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce to you the director of our program in African American history, Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens. Professor Cooper Owens is a Linda and Charles Wilson Professor in the History of Medicine and the director of the Humanities Medicine program at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. She is an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, a past American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Research Fellow, and has won a number of prestigious honors and awards for her scholarly and advocacy work in reproductive and birthing justice. A popular public speaker, certainly, Dr. Cooper Owens has spoken widely across the US and Europe. She has published articles, essays, book chapters, and think pieces on a number of issues that concern African American experiences and reproductive justice. Dr. Cooper Owens recently was selected as the 2022 Agnes Dillon Randolph Award winner by the University of Virginia's Eleanor Crowder Bjorling Center for Nursing Historical Inquiry. Her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won a Darlene Clark Hine Book Award from the Organization of American Historians. As the best book written in African American women and gender history, it has just been translated into Korean. Anyway, I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Cooper Owens to tonight's Juneteenth celebration.
I am so sorry. I should know better. So thank you so much, Mike. I was muted as I was talking. I want to thank all of you, our special guests, our attendees, for helping the Library Company and the program in African American history affiliated with the Library Company in Philadelphia to commemorate Juneteenth. It is certainly a momentous occasion. As we know, the Juneteenth holiday is now a federal one. And I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I am so glad that we are able to listen to poet David Mills and scholar, author Stephanie Jones Rogers as they help to enlighten us and inspire us to really concentrate on the history of people of African descent, the history of United States slavery, and especially the history and the symbolism and the importance of Black liberation. There are a number of you in the audience whose names have popped up, who I know, and I just thank you so much for always being supportive. If you'd like to continue your support in other tangible ways, please visit the librarycompany.org website, and you can find out how to support the program in African American history. So the order of the program will follow. We'll have Mr. David Mills share his art with us, his poetry, and then we'll hear from Professor Stephanie Jones Rogers. So I'm going to read their bios first. Mr. Mills holds an MFA from Warren Wilson College and an MA from New York University. He's published 3 poetry collections, The Dream Detective, The Sudden Country, and After Mystic, a book about Massachusetts slavery poems, or I should say a poetry book about Massachusetts slavery. Individual poems have appeared in Plowshares, Brooklyn Rail, Colorado Review, Crab Orchard Review, Jubilat, Callaloo, Obsidian, and Fence. Mr. Mills has also received fellowships from the New York Foundation for the Arts, Bread Loaf, and the Lannan Foundation. He lived in Langston Hughes's landmark Harlem home for 3 years. He wrote the audio script for MacArthur Genius Award winner Deborah Willis's curated exhibition, Reflections in Black, 100 Years of Black Photography, which showed at the Whitney and Getty West museums. The Juilliard School of Drama commissioned and produced a play by Mr. Mills, and he has also recorded his poetry on ESPN and RCA Records. Thank you so much, David, for joining us and sharing your art with us. Next, you will hear from Stephanie Jones Rogers. You all know I always have to give a little preamble for the folk that I know. I have literally followed Professor Jones Rogers' career since she was a graduate student. And I am so happy and proud of all of the accomplishments that she's had since that time. Stephanie Jones Rogers is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley, where she specializes in African American history, women's and gender history, and the history of American slavery. She is the author of They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, published by Yale University Press in 2019, which won the Lapidus Center for the Historical Analysis of Transatlantic Slavery from the Schomburg Institute, their 2020 Harriet Tubman Prize for the best nonfiction book, published in the US on the slave trade, slavery, and anti-slavery in the Atlantic world, the Southern Association for Women's Historians 2020 Julia Cherry Spruill Prize, awarded for the best book in Southern women's history, the Southern Historical Association's 2020 Charles S. Sydnor Award, which is awarded for the best book in Southern history published in odd number year, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, that's SHEAR, their 2020 Best Book Prize, and the Organization of American Historians 2020 Merle Curti Prize for the best book in American social history. So it's a suite. That's just what we're going to say. It was a suite. Jones Rogers is also the first African-American and third woman to win the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in history since the award's inception in 1980. And just because the library company knows who to get to give you information, Martha Jones, who was the Black History Month speaker just a few years ago, won the LA Times Prize this year. They Were Her Property is based on Jones Rogers' revised dissertation, which won the Organization of American Historians Lerner Scott Prize for the best doctoral dissertation in US women's history. And Professor Jones's work has appeared in Slavery and Abolition, Women's America, Refocusing the Past, Sexuality and Slavery, Reclaiming Intimate Histories in the Americas, as well as online platforms. She's currently at work on a few new projects. Her second book, Women of the Trade, under contract with Liverite, reorients our understanding of the British Atlantic slave trade by centering the lives and experiences of English, African, and Afro-English women, free and captive, in its telling. Organized like the typical slave ship journey, Women of the Trade crafts a narrative about the British slave trade in which English and African women were fundamental, one wherein their financial investments and support, their strategies and political maneuvering, their labor and commercial savvy, their love and their resistance proved crucial. Her third, Women, American Slavery and the Law, also under contract with Liverite, will be the first book-length manuscript to examine the relationship between gender and the evolution of American slave property law in both the North and the South, from the colonial period to slavery's end. It considers how the gradual abolition of slavery in the North affected free women's lives, especially those who owned enslaved people. It also examines the relationship between the expansion of slavery into the West and the implementation of laws that protected married women's property rights, particularly those living in newly formed states in which slavery would become economically fundamental. More profoundly, it explores how slave-owning women's actions, particularly their demands that local and state courts recognize their rights to hold enslaved people in bondage, shaped the legal transformations that unfolded in both regions. And her study, She Had a Womb Subjected to Bondage, the Afro-Atlantic Origins of British Colonial Descent Law, examines the ways that West African customs and laws influenced English thinking about matrilineal descent and may have influenced their decision to implement matrilineal descent laws in the North American colonies. Funds from the NEH, the Ford Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation has supported Professor Jones's work. So without further ado, I introduce to you David Mills, and after his presentation, you'll hear from Stephanie Jones-Rogers. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Professor Cooper Owens, for that fulsome introduction. Ms. Brock, Ms. Smith, Mr. Barsanti, and Professor Rogers. I'm going to be reading actually from my latest collection called Bone Yarn, which is a book-length look at slavery in New York City, where the oldest and largest slave cemetery in the United States is located in the Wall Street area. There are 15,000 bodies there in a 7-acre space. This first piece is a persona poem in the voice of an individual that I've named Peggy, which is actually my mother's name. There's only one full name of someone known who is buried in the cemetery. And unlike in the South, one of the distinctions, certainly in New York and Northern slavery, was that the enslaved lived in the cellars or attics of their owners. And so this enslaved individual, Peggy, is cooked in this house and lives in the cellar where the kitchen is. And occupations were rigid in terms of gender, whether you're free or enslaved or white women at this time. Well, bless this house, Peggy. Backstairs twisting like my braids every time I gently place tray after hot tray on that dusty top step. My bulky reflection tangled in the platter's words. Bless this house. Must be only the Mrs. Parts that's talking, cause there's little blessed living in this here cellar. But she and me got the hours straight. 8s, 12s, 6s, Sunday 6s is 5. When the tips of my fingers tap my side of the door. Wait, tap again till I hear her clear her throat. Then I know the mistress knows their eats is ready. In their world where people only belch and dream, the rest of her family think supper just shows up. This next piece, in sort of in concert or dovetailing with what I was just talking about in terms of the rigidity, in terms of occupations along gender lines, there was a revolt in New York in 1712 where 24 enslaved individuals, some free blacks and some enslaved Native Americans, tried to set the city on fire in hopes of destroying the whole city. Digging deeper and deeper and deeper, finally was able to find the names of 3 women who participated in this revolt, 3 enslaved women. One of 2 was pregnant They were all captured. All who participated were captured, hung, broken on the wheel, burned at the stake. But between Abigail and Sarah, one of the two women who were pregnant, and history doesn't know this, it's not me being lazy, they kept her alive until she gave birth, and then they hung her. So this is a piece. She was in the City Hall dungeon, which is right where modern day City Hall is. And she was locked in that dungeon, and above were all these legal activities going on. So there's a lot of diction of the law that you'll hear. And then there's diction around birthing. Woolsey was a type of material that enslaved were given to, like, make their clothes usually once a year. A necessary tub was like a bucket where one would, defecate. She was chained to this stone wall, and the stones that were used to make the wall in the basement of City Hall were actually part of the stones that were used to build the wall that now we know as Wall Street. Wall Street is called Wall Street because enslaved Africans built a wall from river to river in Lower Manhattan to keep out the English and the Native Americans. This is called Witch Chew. In a pinched and dank corner cell at the corner of Wall and Broad, without interrogation or constitution, beneath ruling and arches, 4 dials on a clock, beneath arguments and archives, petite jurors and Supreme Court, beneath criers and bailiffs, peals and flutters, beneath bells and constables and birds and cupolas, beneath perches and deputies, whipping posts and small talk, beneath windows and gilt, wainscot and lawyers, beneath deep thought and bench wigs, warrants and decorum, beneath 2 floors and black robes, conviction and hand-wringing, beneath plaintiffs and gavels, punishment and appeal, beneath charge and indictment, a hung head's arrest, beneath a trial and its rumors, before acquittal and pardon, there's a case and its verdict before a judge and one's peers, beneath sentences and pillory evidence and stairwells, between wrongdoing and wrong done and who's right and what's wrong, the City Hall dungeon, where in darkness lies a woman with child. So no question of where labor, but when labor, what labor? Slave, who labor even in labor? Sarah, Abigail, which is dying to lie on her left side, shackled to staples with staples affixed to history. Stone slaves once quarried to build a wall boiled down to a street. Which one's water break? Which one gush or trickle? Damp to the woolsey, sweet to the nose. How hard? When tender? Abdomen. When hard? How tender? Uterus, ache. How dull? Shackled to the staple, to the bolted, to the agony. Stone slaves once used to build. Pressure, pelvis. How long? When is during between? What is between enduring? The stench of a necessary tub? Contractions? Waves are water's pushy guess. 45 seconds ago, which one's still talking? Maybe one, shackled to the staple, to the bolted, to the memory. Stone slaves once used. Maybe 15 minutes later, maybe one, maybe a minute or two later, or half a minute longer. Stretch marks, silence. Which one stomachs a punch, clinch, a fist, breathe into the lower back, into the ache, knowing you got not even a sip of say-so over your captive shoe music composed on the floor above you, shackled to the staple, to the bolted, to these echoes. There are a lot of persona poems in this book because I had no names or one full name of 15,000 enslaved ancestors. So it became this sort of like having to have conversations with pictures, with sort of anthropological information, what have you. So inventing narratives. So this next piece, it's not particular to enslaved boys, but there were enslaved boys in New York City who worked as chimney sweep apprentices. So if you think Mary Poppins, Dick Van Dyke, he was the chimney sweep. And so the boys were called chimney sweep apprentices, and there was an enslaved adult male who kind of ran the show. And I don't know if any of you, I'm sure all of you heard the phrase light a fire under him. That actually comes from chimney sweep work, because the young boys wouldn't want to climb up there, so they would light a match under their feet to get them to go up into the flue. And the earliest cancer that we know of, the scrotal cancer, was associated with these young boys. They would do this work in the winter, often around the winter holidays, and they would go out at like 4 or 5 in the morning yelling for, getting work, and then they're climbing up these flues. It's like 20, 10 degrees. Then they're climbing up flues that are 100, 115 degrees. So this is in the voice of one of these young boys. And the chimneys were a brick wide and a brick and a half long. Chimney sweep apprentice. I'm what happens when a house breathes out, sore black breath in a New York throat, trapped caterpillar, what they think of me, owners of these homes and white master who hires me out the black master sweep, elbows, ankles, knees up zigzag chimneys, squeeze of heat and dusk, soot head to toe, dirt thick as a shirt, palms facing out, stomach up against an empty. My days a brick wide and a brick and a half long. I could die here. But brush above my head, I chuck soot, chip tar with a scraper, black rain peppering my neck, the hot rim of my eyes, filth to the sides of flues, mazes sticky with poison, hearth to cap damper. Started prenticing when I was 6. Now I'm 18. Flesh leathery, ankles swell to black apples. Growing a stunt. Can't say which is better, cramped heat or winter's chill. My cry, soot, oh, weep, weep, on the street or pinched in the flu. My life up in nothing but smoke. So the piece about Sarah and Abigail is part of a kind of quartet, if you would, of poems. And the piece I read to you previously, where she's jailed in the City Hall dungeon, is sort of isolating one area. Now this other piece I'm going to read is called Which One? And it's sort of the arc of the whole narrative about the revolt or their participation and then the being captured. And she was hung in a gibbet. You could think of it as almost like a human bird cage as an example to any other enslaved New Yorkers who might want to revolt. There's references here again to gestation, pregnancy, birthing. Playing the lady was a term that was used for enslaved women if they wanted to, so to speak, get out of more difficult work. There's references like 4-month feeling it. There's Father's Joy and Prophetess, which are the Hebrew names for Sarah and Abigail, or the meanings of it. Geisbert and Stoffel were their owners. Nori was vernacular for midwifery knowledge that the enslaved might have. Cohosh and black heart and blue cohosh were things used to help with easing birthing. So this is called Which One? And again, this is this history where it's like, oh, it's either Abigail or Sarah. They can't say which one it is, but one of these two women was pregnant, captured, jailed, hung, and kept alive until she gave birth and then hung. Which one? 1712 slave revolt, New York. Abigail, Sarah, equally rebels, but which one womb? Nearly 9 months, 200 bone home. Which one want to usher to this ugly life? A black lilac hoping to bloom in the family way. Which old soul for newborn? Which one 6 sweet teeth? Which nearly milk belly swell? Which one raise hell to raise child free? Which one her one hope to see April shower, but won't see May flower? See, she never cottoned to the long hour. Which long since maiden lying in wait, maiden lane, half basket hilt, poised, undaunted before urine and shit? Sugar, maple, which one crouched near its long winged seeds and sweet eventual sap? Which one nurturing fetus and fire in her belly, planning to birth murder? Which one blood stopped, menses, months before she made colonial blood flow? See, she done playing the lady for a bit less backbreak and a little more cornmeal. Which one struck flint to gunpowder? Which one bone girdle? Which one 4-month feel it, the quickening? Which one sensed baby leg move, palm blossom, tiny fingers fist? Which one looked down as something somersaults in her stomach? Which one fetus scoop, atlas for embryo, delivery date glow between darkened nipple and hip, sanguine between cock and shot? Which one tender 9-moon knot? What the etymology of Sarah, of Abigail, of air? Which father's joy? What prophetess? Which Genesis? What testament? Where Africa in these appellations? Which Geisbert? Which Stoffel? Which Vandenberg? Which Pels? Which doctor? Peter? Which root doctor? Morning sickness? Midwife Nori? When? When to administer black haw or blue cohosh? In the lying-in room? How long to decompose this inky composition, for this alphabet to utterly flesh itself out? Which one, like her body, eventually had her sentence suspended? Which one hid beside the same kind of wood she'll hang from? Hard. Which will you give leave to give birth, only to turn around and take her life? Why? Tell me, which one will be for months or days or weeks a scorned warning, festooned in a braided chain, meant to halt the dim ideas of the others? I, which gibbet will be choked up, stunned, unable to shed this teeming black teardrop? I'll read this other piece that's connected with the 1712 slave revolt in New York City, and I thank you all for being here. It's called Mercy. As I said, there were 24 enslaved individuals who were either hung, burned at the stake, broken at the wheel, and there was a hysteria that took over the white colonial settlers after the revolt, and I'm not saying maybe not without cause, but there were enslaved individuals who were killed who had not participated, and this is about one of these individuals. Trying to find the poem. Sorry. Goodness, just give me a second. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's just. Oh, okay, sorry. I thought I had the right page. Okay, and he was referred to as Klaus. Kip was a street in Lower Manhattan at the time, and he was broken at the wheel. So his limbs tied to like a wagon wheel and like a an executioner smashing his limbs until he died. Mercy. The epigraph is from Thomas Jefferson's notes on Virginia. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. Thomas Jefferson. Mercy. Along the city's shoreline by the wharf where a peck of slaves were auctioned, Klaus might have heard tell how Robin sunk a penny knife into the conch below his owner's shoulder. Now barefoot he is stripped to the waist, spread eagle, bound to a wagon wheel, spokes versed in grass and its green obedience, mud's scorched metamorphosis, the way snow delivers news piecemeal from the heavens. Limbs stretched and slowly rotated on that wheel, Klaus absorbs the dust, the turns, the deliveries, each journey's leg and arm. Executioners seldom traffic in compassion. This one punishes Klaus bottom up. First, a sledgehammer rains on his shins. Jesus, have mercy, he screams and rotates until they snap between gaps of the wheel. A wooden cudgel sings to his kneecaps. He howls and rotates till they shatter. Even the chalky, taunting throng winces. Then the thunder of an iron bar is administered to his forearms. He shrieks and rotates till they're smashed. The elbows, the chest, the endless bone cracking caught a quarter-mile off until, against God's own architecture, each limb dips like a fractured hammock. On the commons between Broadway and Kip, the wheels nailed high on a pole. Sparrowhawks peck at the broken body. For 4 days, for likely only having offered Robin a penny knife or shelter in the wee hours of an April morn, Klaus is bloody, billowing laundry. Only death has the stomach to dry. Thank you. And as I said, well, maybe I didn't say, but Klaus did not participate in the actual revolt, but was killed in the roundup in the hysteria. I thank you so much for this opportunity.
So first, I'd like to thank Dr. Cooper Owens for that really lovely introduction and for inviting me to share some of my work with you today. I'd also like to thank the program in African American Studies African American History, for sponsoring this event, and also to Deja Brock and Jasmine Smith. Thank you too. I want to really thank you and show you my appreciation by thanking you for all of your hard work in organizing everything today. And last but not least, of course, I thank each of you for coming, even if it's virtually. It's truly a pleasure to be with you tonight. On February 4th, 1937, when he was approximately 87 years old, Lit Young sat down with Alex Hampton, an employee from the federal government, who wanted to interview him about his life in bondage. According to Mr. Young, he was kept enslaved by a white woman named Martha Gibbs. He remembered Martha Gibbs as a big, rich Irish woman who wasn't scared of no man. She owned and operated a big steam sawmill, which happened to be on the Warner Bayou in Vicksburg, which emptied into the Mississippi River. She also owned a significant number of enslaved people. She owned so many, in fact, that she had to build 2 sets of whitewashed quarters with glass windows to house them all. Although she didn't want her slaves to, quote, call God's name, end quote, and she instructed the so-called yellow man preacher to tell her slaves to obey their master and mistress, she nonetheless looked after her slaves' spiritual health. Mr. Young also told Alex Hampton that his mistress built a nice church with glass windows and a brass cupola just for their worship. Moreover, she fed them well, but she worked them extremely hard too. Twice married and once widowed, Martha Gibbs wouldn't permit either of her 2 husbands to interfere with her financial affairs, including the management of the enslaved people she owned. In step with other slave owners throughout the South, Gibbs employed an overseer to make sure that the enslaved people she owned efficiently performed the tasks that were delegated to them. Her decision to employ an overseer wasn't about or motivated by her sense of ineptitude at slave management or discipline. Quite the contrary, in fact. She frequently oversaw her overseer. Almost every morning, Young remembered her buckling on 2 guns and coming out to the place to personally ensure that things were running smoothly. Mr. Young also remembered that she outcussed a man whenever things didn't go right. Well, sometime after the Confederate surrender, and for reasons that remain unclear, local Union officers arrested Martha Gibbs, locked her up in the Black Folks Church, kept her under constant guard for 3 days, fed her hardtack and water, yuck, and then released her. When the soldiers freed her from captivity, she freed the enslaved people she owned, but only temporarily. One day, after her husband left home to purchase corn to feed his livestock, she gathered up 30 of her slaves and 11 wagons. Then she forced the enslaved men, women, and children, both young and old and in between, to walk approximately 215 miles from Vicksburg, Mississippi, to a place that was just 3 miles from Marshall, Texas. She even hired Irishmen guards with rifles to make sure that none of these freed slaves had run away during the journey. As everyone stopped to rest, these guards tied the men to trees to prevent them from absconding. Then, on June 19th, 1866, sound familiar? 1 year after Martha Gibbs's legally free but still enslaved people made their first crop in Texas, and 1 year to the day when Union General Gordon Granger read General Order No. 3 in Galveston, Texas, a pronouncement which declared all enslaved people free in the state, Martha finally let Young and the other African Americans she held in bondage go. As rumors of slavery's possible and then impending unraveling made its way throughout the South via newspapers, letters, and hearsay, and when the arrival of Union troops signaled irreversible transformations in the institution, white slave-owning women like Martha Gibbs considered emancipation, and the thought of it was a horror. Black freedom was a nightmare that few slave owners wanted to live to see. But for slave-owning women whose lives were predicated upon the personal ownership and control of enslaved African Americans, and who typically owned slaves more than any other form of property, such an outcome signaled their financial destruction, and the passage and implementation of the Emancipation Proclamation brought that hard fantasy to life. Slave-owning women lived all or most of their lives in households and communities profoundly shaped by the constant presence of enslaved African Americans and their labor. And they cultivated identities that were intricately tied to their personal ownership of those individuals. They bought, sold, and even rented enslaved people to others over the course of their lives. They bequeathed enslaved people to their children, friends, and other kin. They fought with and waged legal battles against some of these same people, including their husbands, community members, and strangers, just to maintain their economic ties to the institution. So after lifetimes shaped by slavery and persistent efforts to sustain it, slave-owning women were not willing to accept Black freedom. They graded against emancipation, not simply because they embraced ideas about enslaved people's inferiority, which they did, or because the political oppression that would likely follow the Confederacy's loss of the war would be too much. The idea didn't cause them dismay simply because their social status would diminish with the loss of their husband's wealth or financial standing in their respective communities. They weren't disheartened and morose just because they might have to take on the work of formerly enslaved people after the war. Although all of these things caused white slave-owning women tremendous concern and distress, emancipation was extraordinarily difficult for them to bear because it decommodified Black people and robbed them of their primary source of personal wealth. To slave-owning women then, the Civil War was a personal battle which they vigilantly took on in order to stave off the eventuality of Black freedom and ensure their continued financial autonomy, stability, and survival in the process. Surrounded by thousands of enslaved people who would eventually be free to exist in whatever ways they chose, slave-owning women constantly encountered physical reminders of their impending economic strife. the individuals who embodied their fiscal loss and defeat. Over the course of the war and after it ended, these women wrestled with the possible implications of emancipation and did whatever they could to distance themselves from the reality of losing the wealth that was bound up in the bodies of the enslaved. And their methods of reckoning had tremendous and traumatic impacts upon African-American lives. White women's efforts to retain possession of the enslaved people they owned often led them out of Southern households and into more treacherous wartime terrain that included Union encampments, courtrooms, tribunals, as well as innocuous segments of the Southern landscape that could become a bloody battlefield at any time. In these spaces, white women attempted to reclaim enslaved people and cling to the remnants of the peculiar institution amidst its daily fragmentation and dissolution. And as Lit Young's reflections reveal, sometimes they held on to slavery and enslaved people long after President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Granger read General Order No. 3, and the states ratified the 13th Amendment. Ultimately, these women chose to wage a war of their own making, one which they hoped would preserve their economic investments in slavery and help them keep African Americans enslaved. As slave-owning women observed the signs of slavery's destruction all around them, they often employed tactics of economic preservation that ranged from passive to aggressive strategies. At their best, slave-owning women freed their slaves and hired them to work for wages even before Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. One slave-owning woman, for example, liberated all of her people about 3 years before the Civil War and gave each of them a home for as long as they lived. But at their worst, they engaged in traumatic and brutal acts of violence against the people they kept in bondage. In between these two extremes lay a host of strategies that white women hoped would allow them to hold on to the institution and enslaved people for a little while longer. When enslaved people escaped to Union lines, slave-owning women in Union states appealed to the federal government, and high-staking Union officials for compensation, for protection of their investments in slavery, or for help in reclaiming the enslaved people they owned when inferior officers dismissed their demands. Others visited these men and went to military camps to repossess enslaved people. They also imprisoned enslaved people within their homes and within makeshift jails to prevent them from escaping and intensified their pre-war brutality against them. And as Union forces drew closer to their farms and estates, slave-owning women packed up and moved themselves and their slaves out of the federal government's reach, a process called running or refugeeing. They sold them and they pocketed the money too. And when circumstances became bleak, they relinquished their property rights and people and forced enslaved people off of their lands. Inevitably and with great difficulty, they came to terms with the financial significance of Black freedom and reconstructed their lives without enslaved people. But of all the strategies that white slave-owning women used to stave off emancipation and Black freedom, refugeeing might seem the most innocuous. After all, refugeeing merely involves relocating from one region that was threatened by Union occupation to an area deemed safer or out of the Union's reach. And it was a process in which Southerners from across the region engaged out of fear of wartime destruction. But many of them, including slave-owning women, refugeed in order to keep enslaved people out of the hands of those who could set them free. These women knew that Union and Confederate officers commonly confiscated African Americans, and they knew enslaved people willingly fled to Union encampments on a routine basis. These women hoped to avoid both of these possibilities, so they engaged in refugeeing instead of staying put. Wiley Childress's mistress, Jane Boxley, for example, took him, his mother, and all of his siblings to the mountains near their home until the war ended. Charlie Pye's mistress, Mary Ely, owned a large number of enslaved people and refugeed to Alabama, trying to avoid meeting the Yanks, as he said. Maddie Lee's mistress, Mrs. Baker, took the people she considered her property from Franklin Parish, Louisiana, to Texas in hopes of escaping, in hopes of keeping them out of the Union's reach. And Maddie said that her mistress refugeed because she, quote, was afraid the Union soldiers would take her slaves away from her, end quote. These slave-owning women were seemingly unafraid of what the Union soldiers would do to them personally or physically, because they were more concerned with the financial harm these men would bring if they took the people they considered their property away from them. Scores of women echoed these concerns and moved their slaves out of the Union's way. And Texas, the home of Juneteenth, the site of Juneteenth, was often the destination that they chose. Hannah Kelly's mistress, Lou Doward, for example, moved her enslaved people from Louisville, Kentucky to Texas. In addition to that, Eliza Ripley and her family decided to refugee to Texas because they had, quote, the feeling that the Federals could never get a foothold on its boundless prairies, end quote. And quote, above and beyond all, they could take refuge in Mexico if the worst came to the worst, end quote. Well, the worst came to the worst. And so Ripley and her family fled from Texas to Mexico. And then finally, they settled in Cuba with some of the enslaved people that she owned. Texas wasn't far enough. The prospect of living in a world surrounded by free African Americans was abhorrent to many of these women, and some of them were willing to relinquish ties to their property and their country to avoid having to face that reality. As emancipation became a near certainty, a woman from Georgia named Sarah H. Maxwell wrote to the Mississippi commander of the Cavalry Corps with an unusual proposition. She proposed that if the government would agree to buy her land, she would transport all of her former slaves to Africa, accompany them there to make sure that they got settled in, and then establish herself in another part of the world, not Africa. It doesn't appear as if she asked those enslaved people if they wanted to live in Africa at all. In fact, none of these women were remotely concerned about how enslaved people would find their loved ones and reconstitute the families that white folks severed through sale and inheritance. If Maxwell's plan had proven successful, she would have made the prospect of reunion even more bleak for the men, women, and children that she owned. The practice of refugeeing was traumatic for enslaved people, and white slave-owning women knew it. Josephine Pugh, a married woman who happened to be the sister of Confederate General and Louisiana Governor Francis T. Nichols, said as much in her account of the Civil War. While she watched many of the Louisiana families around her flee encroaching Union forces and relocate to Texas, she and her family stayed put for reasons that she made very clear. Her family recognized the, quote, aversion of the Negro to breaking up and moving to a new country, end quote. And, quote, thinking that their demoralization, meaning their dis-ease, their resistance, their rebellion, all of that comes with demoralization, would be less complete at home. She and her loved ones chose to pitch their battles right there in Assumption Parish, Louisiana. Enslaved people had more than an aversion to refugeeing. The practice of refugeeing brought about the same kind of familial and community separation as did forced migration to the Deep South, severances related to white slave owners' inheritance practices, and slave sales. Slave owners often took the most valuable and able-bodied enslaved people with them and left the aged, the infirm, and the very young behind. And in doing so, slave owners left the enslaved people who were the least able to care for themselves in the worst circumstances possible for survival. Moreover, white women often took enslaved people away from the only homes they ever knew and communities that could tie them to their lost loved ones. But even if white slave-owning women refugeed within their home states, like Sally Rhett did when she took her slaves from Sterling to Abbeville, South Carolina, such decisions made it even more difficult for long-lost family members to find each other. Sylvie Granville and members of her family decided, and they were Sally's former slaves, they decided to move back to Sterling after the war. And their decision to do so really, I think, attests to the importance of place for enslaved people, even if that place was a place of enslavement and bondage and trauma and brutality. Nevertheless, it was their home. And so their attempts to establish their lives as free people were sometimes tied to these places too. Of course, for white slave-owning women, refugeeing wasn't about preserving enslaved people's familial ties or their memories of home. It was a strategy that they used to escape the enemy, and one that they used in hopes that to remove enslaved people from the Union's reach and to protect their human property, or so-called human property, in the process. Still, refugeeing was a risky strategy for slave owners and for the people they owned. Confederate soldiers could impress able-bodied enslaved men, which means they could force them to work on fortifications and trenches, and sometimes even on battlefields, removing bodies and so forth. Or they could unleash their wrath upon the sojourners, upon the travelers. The same held true for Union forces that took slaves to their encampments and left slave-owning women without their most productive workers, and also left family members without loved ones. It was also tricky because Union officers knew about the practice and they understood its purpose, and they sometimes stood in the way of white women's plans to do this. Henry Miller's mistress, for example, learned firsthand how troublesome Union officers could be when she tried to relocate with the slaves she owned. She packed up about 12 of her slaves and began to trek to the quote unquote woods country. These were fear-filled excursions, and Henry's mistress became so anxious and so nervous that she lost her sense of direction. In the midst of her confusion, she did, quote unquote, done the worst thing she could, end quote, and run right into a Yankee camp. The Union soldiers questioned the slaves that she had with her about where they came from. They eventually freed them and sent them home. Admittedly, staying put on a plantation, managing the affairs of the estate, and overseeing its cultivation and production, all in the face of military conflict, called for tremendous bravery on the part of these women. I'll give them that. But packing and picking up, gathering their most valuable property, including their slaves, and relocating to an uncharted territory where they had never been before, required a different kind of courage entirely. White women engaged in this practice repeatedly, with and without a white male presence. And when contemplating the dangers of their decisions, they believed that preserving their financial well-being and simultaneously robbing enslaved people of their freedom by moving them beyond military and governmental reach was more important than the possible risks to their personal safety. Eventually, white slave-owning women came to realize that nothing they could do would prevent the inevitable. The war eventually ended, and so did slavery. We know this story, without a considerable delay or compensation for slave owners living outside of Washington, D.C. And so for those of you, if you have questions about that, in 1862, Washington, D.C. did in fact pass a bill to compensate slave owners for willingly freeing enslaved people. So they did compensate slave owners who applied for compensation in Washington, D.C., but that only applied to D.C. It didn't apply beyond the perimeter, the boundaries of D.C. So these formerly slave-owning women outside of DC received no compensation. And then former slave-owning women had some really poignant thoughts about the fact that slavery was over and they got nothing for it. On June 13, 1865, Eva Jones, a former slave owner from Georgia, penned a letter to her mother-in-law in which she contemplated the meaning of slavery's end. "I suppose you've learned," Eva wrote, "that even in the most secluded portions of the country, that slavery is entirely abolished. A most unprecedented robbery and a most unwise policy," she said. The destruction of slavery left Eva astounded and broken, with the magnanimous task of reconstructing her life from a, quote, heap of ashes and ruins and ashes, end quote. For Eva, Black freedom was nothing short of a criminal act committed on such a grand scale that it would result in a, quote, joyless future of probable ignominy, poverty, and want, end quote. Sometimes, just reading these words, it's just so profound to me that, this is, anyhow. She believed that emancipation would bring about, quote, a life robbed of every blessing, end quote, for her and similarly situated people living in the South, simply because it was devoid of slaves, okay? She wasn't alone in her thinking. Ella Thomas also reflected deeply upon how she would reckon with the economic impact of the conflict and its aftermath. Initially, she was optimistic. "I'm not the kind of person to permit pecuniary loss to afflict me as long as I have health and energy." I should have done that with a Southern accent, I know. That's what she wrote. And then Ella recognized that emancipation would impact her financially, but she also saw slavery as a burden, and she was glad to rid herself of this encumbrance. "As to the emancipation of the Negro," she said, "there's of course a natural dislike to the loss of so much property, But that sounds British, but my innermost soul, I cannot regret it. I always felt that there's a great responsibility. It is in some degree a great relief to have the feeling removed. That's what she said. It only took 4 weeks for her disposition to change. By June, she, quote, heartily despised Yankees, Negroes, and everything connected with them. Over the course of the next 4 months, the reality of Ella's financial loss and its cataclysmic impact upon her way of life made her bitter, shook her resolve, and fractured her religious foundation. Before the war, she and her husband owned 90 enslaved people collectively, and she stood to inherit even more of them from her father's estate. But with slavery's erosion, with slavery's abolition, she predicted that her family's, quote, state of affluence, end quote, would dissolve into one of, quote, comparative poverty, end quote. Ella was particularly perplexed by the personal losses that she would inevitably suffer as a consequence of emancipation. Quote, so far as I am individually concerned, I am reduced to utter beggary. For the $30,000, and that would be in a six-figure range today, if we were to calculate its buying power, $30,000, the buying power of $30,000 today, it'd be in the six-figure range. So the $30,000 Pa gave me when I was married was invested in Negroes alone. This view of the case I did not at first take, and it is difficult now to realize it. I did not know how intimately my faith in revelations and my faith in the institution of slavery had been woven together. Slavery was done away with, and my faith in God's holy book was terribly shaken. I alone know the effect the abolition of slavery has had upon me. For many former slave-owning women, the realization of that effect brought about woe and great distress. They didn't believe the government would simply do away with slavery at first, but they soon witnessed the actualization of the government's plan to emancipate enslaved people, and with great intimacy, they experienced the economic, quote, effect of abolition, end quote, upon their lives. In response, they grieved their financial losses, they denied formerly enslaved people rights and liberty, sought to coerce them to work as they had in slavery, and adapted old management methods to accommodate new labor arrangements. Many reckoned with poverty and starvation, and a lucky few still held on to some of their antebellum wealth in spite of the substantial devaluation that followed emancipation at the close of the war. For formerly enslaved people, on the other hand, knowledge about precisely when emancipation had come was crucial to their ability to claim their freedom. And for many of them, that information was not always easy to come by. White slave-owning women's decisions to refugee had something to do with that difficulty. When enslaved people lived beyond the reach of Union forces or Freedmen's Bureau agents, these are federal agents that were supposed to assist freed people to kind of establish themselves after slavery was over. Some of them did that, some of them did not. Their female owners simply avoided dealing with the economic reality of emancipation by not telling them that they were free and continuing to demand their labor, just as they had before the war. Ben Lawson, for example, was the only slave that Jane Brazier owned. As a boy, Ben worked 160 acres of Jane's land alongside Jane's son and impoverished white laborers whom she hired. The nearest plantation was at least 15 to 20 miles away, and incredulously, although trapped as he was on Jane's estate, Ben never knew about the Civil War. Jane never told him that he was free either. And since he didn't know, Ben just kept working, just as he had before freedom came. Former slave-owning women's plans to keep the news of freedom from their former slaves, from their former slaves, was not foolproof. However, to their chagrin, other white Southerners who may have had economic motivations in mind passed this information along to these women's former slaves. Fannie Berry, for example, said that she was, quote, free for a long time before she knew it, but this changed because the white woman who she was working for declared, Fannie, you're free and I don't have to pay your master for you now. You stay with me, she said. Whether she told Fannie about freedom because she believed that keeping this information from Fannie was unjust, or whether she did it in order to better position herself to negotiate directly with Fanny for her labor is unclear. Notwithstanding, her choice to disclose the news to Fanny betrayed the chasms that often existed between white women who owned slaves and those who did not. Deeming themselves entitled to the bodies of formerly enslaved children and adolescents in particular, former slave-owning women routinely exploited the chaotic familial circumstances that white migration, slavery, and the war brought about in order to extend their access to young people's labor. Women like the ones who owned Ben Lawson and Fanny Berry often took advantage of their parents' absences in order to coerce them into exploitative labor arrangements. One Natchez, Tennessee woman, for example, called the freed child she still had in her possession her little Confederate N-word. She proudly told Whitelaw Reid, an Ohio journalist, politician, and diplomat who traveled through the South in the year following the war, that this young girl, quote, was the only one she had been able to keep, and she only had her because her parents hadn't been able to coax her away, end quote. When children were isolated from their parents or other African Americans more generally, it was easier for white women to manipulate and deceive them because they could prevent them from knowing about emancipation and their changed status. Within months of General Robert E. Lee's surrender on April 9th, 1865, enslaved and formerly enslaved people began placing advertisements in information wanted and lost friends columns of Southern newspapers, such as the Southwestern Christian Advocate, which ran out of Louisiana. They were searching for their loved ones. These advertisements constituted one of the many strategies they employed in their desperate quests to reconstitute their families after the war. Long after freedom came, they continued searching for them in this way. And I want to also just underscore that refugeeing was really critical to these separations, these further separations, which made these reconstitutions difficult, these reunions, even more difficult than they had been before. In these ads, formerly enslaved people and enslaved people wrote about their mothers, their fathers, their children, siblings, aunts, uncles, and grandparents, many of whom they had not seen for decades, kinfolk who they believed could be alive or dead. These ads were filled with yearning and despair, and the enslaved and free people who placed them often named the white women who were responsible for their suffering and their pain. In the immediate and not so immediate aftermath of slavery, formerly enslaved people traced their lineages through their losses and the separations brought about when their mistresses sold them, when women bought them, when they were given to girls and women as gifts or as part of their inheritances, and when their female owners relocated from the Southeast to the Deep South and Southwest in places like Texas. In the decades following slavery's end, the women who once claimed ownership of these enslaved people and their female descendants were also writing about enslavement and loss, but in a remarkably different way. As the dust of Reconstruction settled, former slave-owning women laid bare their thoughts about the system and how they perceived the roles they played within it. Interwoven within autobiographies of esteemed and privileged living, white women constructed preposterously positive stories of slavery that erased the kinds of trauma, separation, and pain that emerged in formerly enslaved people's lost friends and information wanted ads. When these Southern female authors wrote about enslaved people, there was no brutality, no privation, no agony, no loss, no tears, no sweat, no blood. They portrayed themselves and their female ancestors as forever sacrificing women who played purely benevolent roles within the system. Enslaved people only benefited from their sacrifices and acts of benevolence. They wrote and often expressed their appreciation through unwavering loyalty and love. It was this incongruent reciprocity that led some of these women to openly grieve because their female descendants would, quote, never know the tie that existed between mistress and servant, end quote. Most formerly enslaved people vehemently disagreed with these women's characterizations of the slave trade, of slavery, of the sanitized narratives that these white women wrote about the roles they played in the continued bondage of African descended people. in the days, months, and years immediately following emancipation, and in the most unlikely of literary spaces, formerly enslaved people belied these stories, and revealed white slave-owning women's deep and profound investments in their continued subjugation, as well as the profound roles that former slave-owning women played in their sales and the familial separation that followed. In the briefest of newspaper ads, freed people like Caroline Mason talked about the loved ones they lost because the white women who owned them had sold them in the market and tore them away from everything they loved and everything they knew. I have a sister, Sally Summons, Caroline wrote, that was sold out of the Mason family. She was sold from her 3 children, 2 girls and 1 boy. She was owned by Betsy Mason and was sold by her at Alexandria, Virginia. Just like Caroline, scores of enslaved people provided starkly different understandings of the institution of slavery, what their female owners knew about it, the roles that these women played in their suffering and subjugation, and why these women were so adamantly opposed to Black freedom. And white women's economic investments in American slavery lay at the heart of these formerly enslaved people's reflections. They spoke about how those investments shaped white women's actions within and outside of slave-owning households. They also talked about female owners who procured enslaved people, essentially stole enslaved people from marketplaces and at auctions, not simply through gifts of or inheritance, so within the household, but left their homes to buy and even sell them. They charted the movements of slave-owning women who navigated commercial spaces and took part in economic activities that some historians of slavery have either overlooked or alleged never happened. Time and again, with enslaved people not far from view, white slave-owning women routinely articulated their desires to remain invested in human property in slavery and to pass their financial legacies on to their children. Formerly enslaved people also recalled the ways that white women's slave ownership shaped white people's marital relationships, so their relationships with each other, in ways that challenged common assumptions about the patriarchal order of 19th century households and the influence that Southern laws had upon and within them too. According to free people, slave-owning women argued with their husbands, male employees, community members, and officials about the enslaved people to whom they claimed legal title, how much control they would have over them, and who else would be afforded the privilege of having said control. Slave auction blocks, Southern courtrooms, the pages of local newspapers, military correspondence, and even formerly enslaved people's pension applications when they fought for the Union provided figurative and literal platforms upon which white slave-owning women's profound economic relationships to slavery and their investments in Black people are made clear. In these spaces and in others, white women vocalized their commitments to the institution of slavery, and they conveyed the breadth of knowledge they truly possessed about it. Formerly enslaved people made it plain. White slave-owning women fully embraced the institution of slavery and all the economic benefits that came along with it. They also made it clear that on Juneteenth and well beyond Jubilee, white women kept slavery alive, even when it was illegal to do so. They offered harrowing testimony that revealed how white women kept legally free African Americans enslaved whenever they could. And this weekend, as we celebrate Juneteenth and consider the meaning of this day, I hope we will keep these stark realities in mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Stephanie Jones Rogers and David Mills. I have literally been on my phone and trying to navigate chats because people are saying how moving, how wonderful this program is as we commemorate liberation. So with that said, there are a number of questions that we have. There are a number of folk who are saying, thank you so much. This was an amazing presentation from both of you. So I'm going to start with the first question in our Q&A. And this first question is for you, Stephanie. It is from Amira Lawson. So thank you so much, Amira Lawson, for joining us. This book is so necessary. What was the emotional work you had to do to approach this topic? What has haunted you the most? Hashtag brother haunts me. You're muted, Stephanie. I did it too.
Okay, perfect. I did it I got it the first time, the second time, oh well. But thank you so much, Amira. That's such a wonderful question, because it took an extraordinary amount of emotional work. I often talk very honestly about, the fact that even the revision process, a process that is usually invisible to most people, so not just the writing of it, but the revisioning process was revisiting all of those, harrowing stories over and over and over again. And so that took an emotional toll on me that I did not anticipate. So I gained quite a bit of weight. I mean, I'm very honest about that. I'm fluffy, hey, but I'm still cute. But anyhow, I gained a considerable amount of weight because, I'm an emotional eater. So that was what I did to help to comfort me. I developed a little bit more of a more healthier strategy, which is to watch nature shows, to step away from the work. So what I would often do is when I, confronted a very difficult account or interview, I would, kind of stop, take a moment, walk, step away from the work for a bit. Sometimes I would talk to, my partner, my husband about it, and, just to share, to have a, experience, to not be alone in that experience, and that, and be alone in knowing that information. But nature shows have really been, a godsend to me, a heaven sent to me. And I'm less of an emotional eater when it comes to my work, even though I'm going further back in time in slavery, as you know, from the description, if you made it to the introductions. And so, yeah, so it took an extraordinary amount of emotional work for me. And I would say, if I were to think of a story that really just haunts me to this day, it's what I refer to as the rocking chair incident. And this was an account of it was a young girl. She was, I think, about 9, and her mistress essentially kept her in near starvation. And she also set up a trap. So she put a piece of candy on a dresser in the room that she knew that this little girl cleaned every day. And she waited to see how long it was going to take her to eat this piece of candy. So of course she ate the piece of candy, and she proceeded to, tell her she stole the candy, et cetera, et cetera. And she placed her head under her rocking chair. And then she called she solicited her daughter's help. So the mistress placed her head under the rocking chair and then called her daughter in to whip her. So as her daughter whipped her, she rocked back and forth on her chair, on top, with her chair on top of this young girl's head. And as a consequence, she was irreparably damaged. She was deformed in the face. She couldn't eat solid foods, and so she was haunting. She was haunted by this experience for the rest of her life, and it's one that continues, to haunt me. And I'm just ready for somebody to just, like one of those Tom Cotton people, or to come to McConnell, to come to me and talk to me, and I'd say, oh, let me tell you about this story. Let me tell you about this. I think it's, these are the kind of powerful stories that would, I would hope would change some of these minds. But that's a long drawn out response to your question. But thank you again, Amira. It takes a lot of emotional.
Yeah, we have, and this is a not so shameless plug, we sponsor a group of emerging young scholars, thinkers who are largely undergrads or recent graduates. And we've been talking a lot about the ways that doing archival work and research and writing, because research is so isolating, how it can impact you. And so we've been discussing healthy ways that people have combated that. So, yours is nature shows and the pleasure of eating and food and all of those kinds of things. But that is a harrowing story. So I am going to ask another question. This is in fact from one of our Mellon scholars, Grace Grove, who was a recent graduate headed to grad school. And she has a two-parter. Mr. Mills, what does your writing process look like as you research these events and people? I'm sure you have encountered many stories that inspire you to craft your poems. How do you choose which stories to include in your works? And then next, the next question is for you, Dr. Jones-Rogers. She asks, can you pinpoint a specific piece of evidence that excited you and first inspired your research for this book? So, Mr. Mills, would you like to go first? Oops, I don't know if you're talking, but you need to unmute if you are. Uh-oh. So you know what? Let's start with you, Stephanie. There might be some technical difficulties.
Yeah, sure. So I started this project as in a graduate seminar, and I was really interested in this woman named Marie Delphine Lalaurie from New Orleans. If you watch American Horror Story, you probably saw that season where Kathy Bates, who I love, played a version of her. But anyway, I was really interested in her because she was married, had been widowed prior to being married, this last time. And she owned slaves in her own right, and she controlled those slaves in her own right. So she's known for her brutality and all this kind of sadism, but I was really interested in the measure of control, the amount of control that she seemed to possess over her own property, and the fact that she even had her own property as a married woman. So, I wrote this paper about her, and, I had a classmate, a wonderful classmate, who's from Philadelphia, as a matter of fact, Alex Genter. And she asked me, she said, it's all well and good you found this one lady, but are there other women like her? And so I was like, I don't know. Maybe not. So I started to dig, and I started to go on my little, treasure hunt. And I found in the narratives, in the interviews that the federal government did with formerly enslaved people, I found one interview where this, he wasn't enslaved, but his father was, and he was telling a story about how his father went to a slave auction once and saw that almost the majority of the people at the slave auction were women. And I was like, oh my God. It's just like one of those kind of, I don't know if you do an archival dance, but I do archival dances and jigs and things like that when I find little wonderful tidbits that I'm going to use in my research. And so that was it. That was kind of what I needed to find in the archive to know that this was a viable project. And so from there on, I was like, okay, let's get it started, and so then I just kept finding stuff, after that. And then it culminated in the book. So that was the piece of evidence, that really convinced me that this was a good thing to do.
Wow, amazing. So we have, oh my goodness, the questions are growing. So I'm going to pick, let's see here. There is another question, if I go in order, by another brilliant Mellon scholar who's a part of our summer program, Keziah Jeffries, who's also headed to graduate school. And Keziah asks, how, in California, no less, so you all need to be in. How can we balance the ideas of gender relations presented in your work with women wielding guns and being creditors to their husbands in courts of law, for example, with the understandings of gender and control pushed through the hyperfeminine cult of true domesticity as referenced in the epilogue? So she has done her homework.
Well, yeah, all the terms in there. Okay. So because people, if I'm getting the question, properly, if I'm hearing it properly, you're really interested in how it is that these two characterizations can coexist. How I can find these women in courts doing all this stuff, owning in property in their own name, but then there's also this idea that they're oppressed because of their gender, and these ideas coexisting. Well, I argue that for many years up until my book, pat myself on the back, up until relatively recently, our historians have pursued the narrative of and constructed the narrative of gender oppression at the expense of the narrative of women's subjugation of individuals who are deemed their inferiors. So, that's one of the reasons why this story hadn't yet been told, because we are so interested in how patriarchy, restricts and constrains the lives of women, and rightfully it does. But we also need to be attentive to the ways in which women can find ways to circumvent those constraints. One of the ways that these women in this book circumvented those constraints is by owning enslaved people, by owning Black people. So I think that's I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but that's my attempt to answer your question. And that's a one. You should definitely be in contact with me so that we can hang out for a bit if we're close. I don't know if we're going to be close, but and congratulations too.
Yeah, she's going to a JD PhD program. So now that David Mills is back, Mr. Mills, I'm going to ask you a question that was posed earlier. What does your writing process look like as you research these events and people? The person asking the question says, I'm sure you've encountered many stories that inspire you to craft your poems. How do you choose which stories to include in your works?
It has to have a kind of emotional resonance and a kind of singularity. I mean, the moment with the gentleman being broken on the wheel, I mean, that really, and the fact that he wasn't even involved, even if he was, what a horrific way to die. And then just trying to find, because we have historians like yourself and Professor Rogers, so I'm trying to find song in the history. And a lot of times I'm trying to generate song. It might not, so to speak, be definitively in there in the research I'm doing, but I'm trying to find historical moments that seem to lend themselves to song, if that sort of makes sense. And it's a subjective thing. So I don't know if that's answering the question sufficiently, but that's some of what goes on. Some of it's literally channeling. Some of these poems came to me in pieces and dreams, to be honest with you.
Yeah, the spirit work is important in creating this art and commemorating ancestors. So thank you.
No, thank you.
Yeah, this is another question. Courtney Slavin asks, for Dr. Joan Rogers, in her review of the book, Drew Faust Gilpin suggested that you maybe should have looked more extensively at slaveholders' personal papers to better understand the intimate dynamics of slaveholders' lives, instead of, don't smirk, Stephanie, instead of relying on the testimony of slaves who were not always privy to the events of the Big House. However, there is something so valuable in your methodology of using slave testimonies to construct a narrative of slaveholders, particularly when the reverse has so often been the norm. With these two thoughts in mind, I was hoping you could describe your methodology and how you decided to focus on the sources you choose in telling this history. And I will drink some tea as you answer that.
Please do. Drink tea for the both of us. So first, thank you so much, for that really wonderful and insightful question and informed question. So let me just first start by saying the title is deceptive, because the title will give you the impression that this book is all about white women. But I see this book as a Black history of white women's economic investments in their continued subjugation, their enslavement and their continued subjugation after slavery is over. So when you reorient that perspective, when we reorient that perspective, then what you understand from that point forward is that the central figures here in this story, the storytellers and the individuals who I'm most interested in, are enslaved people. Mm-hmm. And because I'm most interested in enslaved people and most interested in what they have to say about white slave-owning women, that's what this story is about, their understanding of white women's economic investments in the institution of slavery, then you can understand why I centered their voices, why I foregrounded the interviews with them, why I did not foreground and center the voices of white women, why I also was interested in what they had to say about and what they had to tell us about non-elite slave-owning women. So that was really important to me. The vast majority of the women in this book owned less than 5 enslaved people. Mm-hmm. The people who had time to sit down and talk about the corn stalks and, the paint, the whitewashing of the gate in front of the part, the piazza, and all the rest. Those are the people who had typically 20 or more slaves. They were considered elite slaveholders. I wasn't interested in elite slaveholders. You know why? Because we have a gazillion quadrillion books about elite slaveholding women, right? So I was interested also in non-elite slave owning women. And really interested in what enslaved people had to say about them. Now, the problem with non-elite slaveholding women is that many of them were, well, not the problem, but the concern, the issue is that many of them did not read, or they did not write, or they did not do both. So they did not leave their own records behind. They did not leave diaries behind. They did not leave, letters behind. So where to go? Well, enslaved people talked about these women all the time. So for some reason, enslaved people's test interviews, they are essentially an archive of non-elite white women. So I wanted to understand these non-elite white women from the vantage point of the people they owned. That is what this book is. That's what this book is. And so I did look at diaries. But they weren't talking about slavery the way I wanted to understand it. They weren't talking about it the way I wanted to understand it. So I went to the narratives, the testimonies of enslaved people, again, because this is a Black history of white women's economic investments in the institution of slavery. And I wanted to know about non-elite women's economic investments in the institution of slavery, something that cannot be accessed, that's not tangible in traditional archives of elite slaveholding women. So there's that. And I won't even say anything about the who lady. Thank you again. That's a really wonderful question.
Cheers. That's all I'll say. Cheers. And imagine that, hearing the lives of enslaved people in a book about slavery. I have never ever said this book was anything other than that. I mean, in fact, in the beginning of in the preface, I say, this is a book about Black people too. This is a book about white women, but this is a book about Black people too. This is a book that sees those women through the eyes of enslaved people. I was super transparent about that in the beginning. Like, I don't know, like by the time we get to the end, forget, I don't know, maybe, but. Well, thank you for that. Let's see here. I am going to, this one is a good one. This one is a good one. Robert Reed has a question. With the growing anti-critical race theory movement, bundling all education on Black American history as critical race theory, which as professors, we know that's not true, right? Despite what we're reading and hearing, is there a movement created to help get this information written into academic history books, or get books like They Were Her Property onto required reading lists? Thank you so much, Mr. Reed, for that question.
Well, I do know that it's a book that's being put on syllabi throughout colleges and universities and throughout the country, and I'm very, very grateful and happy about that, because the thing is, I've had students tell me, like, they go home and they tell their parents about this work, and that's where it starts. That's where it really starts. But I don't know. I don't think there's a movement. I mean, perhaps, Professor Cooper Owens knows if there's a movement to, to kind of infiltrate, to use their language, infiltrate, the curriculum, the textbooks. I don't know if there's a cohesive movement to do that. I know individuals are doing the work that they need to do, like at the K through 12, the K through 12 stage, level. But I don't know of any, movement to do that, but that'd be useful.
Neither do I. The only thing I know of are historical organizations that are responding to the kinds of falsities and the fictions around history as critical race theory, and critical race theory isn't history. So there have been organizations responding to that, but that's really about it. So this is a great question from Professor De Sousa, who is a Spelman College professor. I always try to give love to my HBCU profs, especially Black women colleges. I'm a graduate of one. And so she asked, Dr. Jones Rogers, given the emotional nature of these horrendous stories, would you recommend your book to undergraduate students?
Yes. I do know that it's been assigned in American capitalism class, in at one of Ivy League universities. It's been assigned to undergraduates. It's been read by undergraduates, even here at Berkeley, where I am. And students have actually come to me and wanted to take classes with me after reading the book. I think it's important for us to be honest with young people about our nation's history, whether that be the pretty parts or the ugly parts. This is the ugly part of that history. And I think it's very important for us to be honest and candid with them about that history, because then they can learn to love America with all the scars and the flaws, you know what I mean? And all the pretty parts. But without that, then they feel deceived. I don't know if you've had this experience at Spelman, but you have a student come in that you expose them to new material that they've never heard of, and then they're mad, and then you got to get they talk them down, and it's like that shouldn't ever have to be the case. I think some of this material should be taught in K through 12. A kind of milder version, but I still think we should start teaching them this truth much earlier than we do. They should not wait until, they should not be just getting it at the once they get to college, and then they're angry at the world because nobody told them before. That was my experience too, and so I remember that. And that's not. It's like somebody telling you Santa Claus doesn't exist. I feel it. And so. Yeah, I think we should be forthright and candid about this history, with undergraduates, and even a little bit earlier than that, if we give them a milder version, an attenuated version, all this kind of vaccine language is floating around.
Yeah, thank you so much for addressing that and for asking the question, Professor De Souza. There is a book called Teaching American Slavery, and it's geared towards teachers from K through 12. Edited by Bethany J. Wall and Cynthia Lyerly. It's award-winning by the American Historical Association. It's a wonderful book. So this will be sent to our members, our supporters, and you can get that book if you're interested in learning methods about how to teach it to children younger than the undergraduate level. So we have 2 more minutes. I mean, there are so many questions. I'm trying to get different ones. Cynthia Adeyemi, who's been really active in our chat, she posted this question to you. What type of pushback, this is a really good one, do you get from exposing slave-owning white women and their non-slave-owning yet benefiting white female peers? To this day, white women, as a collective, are the second wealthiest and less likely to be incarcerated demographic group in this country.
So what's really interesting is I get most of my pushback from white men. I didn't expect that. I expected white women to be coming out of the woodwork, hunt me down, but honestly, I've gotten responses that seem, supportive, responses that seem, appreciative, thank you for your book, et cetera, et cetera. And then I've gotten the nastiness from white men. Which is really strange to me, but also makes sense because, if they think patriarchy is, cool and everything, then they want to do that. But yeah, it's usually, the pushback is usually from white men. And it only seems to come when I'm part of some kind of, newspaper article, or, I give comment on, Trump, women, 53% of white women voting for Trump. That's when I got a lot of nasty stuff, but just on the book itself, no. But when I tie the book to more contemporary stuff, that's when the white men come out of the woodwork. And I'm just like, whatever, get over it. But thank you for that question, Cynthia. I appreciate it.
Okay, I am in fact trying to also respond to some chat questions. So because they're interested in books. This last question, and thank you all so much. I mean, we still have such a large a virtual community here that just shows you the strength of your work. Shanette Garrett Scott had, commented how she just so enthralled and in love with your presentation style. So, I mean, there are so many people here who are just touched by your work. Professor D'Souza talked about the moving testimony of David Mills' poetry. So I'm just really on cloud nine. So this will be the last question. This is from one of our fellows. I'm going to end it here. In your book, to Taylor Smith, who is looking towards applying to PhD programs in African American Studies or Africana Studies, she asked, in the book, the ending includes a discussion of white women's roles in preserving slavery into the Civil War. Additionally, we learn about white women's cultural preservation with organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy, and even today with white mothers spearheading a lot of the pushback in school districts against the teaching of critical race theory. However, I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the economic side of preservation past the Civil War.
That's a good question. So what I argue is that economic dimension, it does stop. You know, because slavery does not exist anymore. That was one of their primary sources of wealth. So what do they do? You know, after slavery is no longer a viable economic engine for them, economic source, resource for them, they double down on white supremacy. That's why you see them at, you know, lynching rituals. You know, they're in the crowds at lynchings of Black men dangling, you know, their bodies dangling. They're, you know, at the forefront of, you know, the KKK. There are 500,000 white women who joined the Klan in the 1920s and 30s. Then you also have women, of course, you know, at the forefront of, and you know, it's a powerful picture of Ruby Bridges, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges going into that New Orleans elementary school, and all those white women across the street, you know, hollering and screaming. These women were at the forefront of the anti-integrationist movement. You know, Elizabeth McCrae has the book Mothers of Mass Resistance, and that book is all about the roles that women played in the kind of white women played in the shaping the educational system, shaping anti-integration, you know, and in the educational system and things like that. But I say that, you know, they double down on white supremacy because that economic element, that economic dimension avenue is no longer available to them. And so eventually it becomes economic. Now, you know, white supremacy pays. You know, look at some of the politicians that are like making a living because they're racist. You know what I mean? So, but after slavery is over, they double down on white supremacy, and that just has to make do. And it seems to make do for them for a while.
Thank you all so much. And you know what? I want to end with something that's in the chat. I don't know who you are, Glenn Finland, but thank you so much for this really, really moving line. And I think it applies to both your work and David Mills. He says, David Mills, and I'm gonna also include Stephanie Jones Rogers, your through lines gives us a beginning, a middle, and a gobsmacking end. Then you hit us with a bell ringer that resonates and leaves us with your work. So Mr. Finland, thank you for those profound words. I think that they are useful, particularly as we commemorate our ancestors as they learned about their liberation so many years ago in Texas, and as Juneteenth becomes a federal holiday. So I thank you all for joining us, for learning, for being inspired, for being touched, for grieving, for laughing, for all of the multiplicities of what history brings for us. So thank you so much, David Mills. Thank you, Professor Stephanie Jones Rogers, for our esteemed director, Dr. Michael Versanti, Jasmine Smith, who is our specialist in early African-American history, and Deja Brock, who is literally the genius behind the scenes, who gets all of this going. And to all of you, thank you so much for your questions, for your comments, for your texts, your messages. We could not have had such a spectacular program without your support. So I wish you all a good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Rogers, Dr. Rogers.
I guess I'll also thank you for joining us. Have a good night, everyone. We'll hope to see you at our next event.
Thank you, Dr. Barsanti.
Thank you.